Hans van Alebeek, former EVP Operations and Technology at Nike, now board member of Bata, enjoys helping consumer-focused companies grow. He was a member of the Nike senior leadership team for almost 2 decades as the company quadrupled to $36 billion in revenue. He oversaw the building of a scalable operational platform as Nike expanded to new geographies, brands, retail, and e-commerce. Hans also served as the Honorary Consul for the Netherlands in Portland for 7 years. He is now a board member at Bata, a global footwear brand, and Suitsupply, an apparel retailer. Here to cover risk and uncertainty in today's supply chain, take it away, Hans.
Wow, this is exciting. You know, when Brian called me and he asked me to talk about supply chain and to be the keynote speaker, I was like, wow, you know, things have really changed in COVID times. It used to be that if you would talk about supply chain, you'd get an empty room. In fact, I remember an investment banker once, we were in New York, and he told me, you know, the supply chain guy in a company is like the long snapper. I don't want to know his name. Because if I know his name, then there's something wrong with the company. And that's pretty much what happened in these COVID times. There has been a lot that has happened with supply chains that have caused real problems. And so now, actually, people tend to know who the supply chain guy is. So I'm looking forward to talking to you a little bit about it. My experience is primarily with Nike, but I've also worked with a lot of smaller companies. And we'll also be happy to answer any questions that you might have. A little bit about myself. Oh, and one of the things we will talk about is why did we run out of toilet paper? Because I think that was a burning question that Brian had. So you can look forward to the answer to that question. So a little bit about myself. You already told a bit about. I grew up in the Netherlands. You might pick that up from my accent. Went to school there. Studied econometrics and operations research. So. Yes, I am a geek and proud of it. Worked for a small company there that sent me all over the world. I worked in Europe and in Asia, and then eventually ended up in the US, where I went to business school at UCLA, which is where I met my good friend Todd. Worked a bit with McKinsey after that, and then joined a real company that I enjoyed working at Nike, and mostly work in the area of supply chain and IT there. Retired about 2.5 years ago, and have been doing board memberships since then, and also helping smaller companies and startup companies with their supply chain challenges. And I've also invested in some of them. Some of them worked out really well, and some of them didn't work out so well, but we can talk about that later. So I don't think this crowd needs a definition of a supply chain, but maybe there is somebody that is not as familiar with it. The way I think about what a supply chain is, it's a network of suppliers with a company that to produce and deliver a product to its end consumer. That's simply what it is. The functions include planning, logistics, buying, making, and storing the product. You know that. The goal of a supply chain really is to capitalize on the investment that a company makes in the brand and the product, to then get a return on an investment by having the right amount of the right product in the right place so the consumer can get there to buy. That's really what the role of the supply chain is. Now, the reason why that's a difficult thing to do is that they tend to be big capital investments and long-term partnerships that you make that are quite inflexible when actual demand is very unpredictable. And that's also been true in these COVID times. And so what you're finding is that a lot of companies are struggling to respond to that uncertainty. And I'll talk a little bit about how to maybe think differently about how to set up a supply chain. So typically when people think about what the goal is of a supply chain, the first word that comes out of mind is, well, lower cost. That's typically, you know, I want to get higher margins. And that is something that is important in a supply chain. And quality is an important thing. Those are the things that people could typically think about. Now, what becomes more and more important is sustainability. And you saw the two companies talk about how sustainability is an integral element of how they manufacture their products. So that is critical nowadays. But what people sometimes don't think about as much is speed and responsiveness, and being able to respond to uncertainty, and building in flexibility and resilience. And I'll talk a little bit more about why those two things are becoming much more important and have become much more important in these recent times. And so if you want to build speed and resilience into your supply chain, what are some things then you have to think about? Well, first of all, forecasting is something that becomes much more difficult in an uncertain environment. So you have to think about more scenario planning and range forecasting. And you typically see companies thinking about what range of sales could I expect versus what do I think my forecast is, and how do I respond to these differences. The other thing, capability is very important, is very fast cross-functional communication, so that what happens in sales and what happens in product development is known directly in the supply chain as well, so they can anticipate and respond to it. So cross-functional communication is absolutely critical in managing a supply chain. Then selecting the right partners, and a lot of times this is something that companies try to do very quickly, but if you're growing, you want to make sure you've picked the right partners and done the due diligence that you have partnerships that you can build on. So those are some important qualities in a supply chain. So I thought I might illustrate this with an example that I worked through myself when I was at Nike. Most of you are familiar with the National Football League. You know that sport. And you may know that Nike signed a contract in 2010 to support the National Football League. Basically means Nike would make the jerseys that the teams play on the field. Now, how would Nike make a return on that investment? Some people may think, well, you can see the brand on TV and that's worth something, and it is. But the real return on this investment comes from selling fanwear and jerseys to consumers. The people that are watching the games, and if you're in Oregon, they will also go skiing with those jerseys. So, and maybe wear it at a barbecue. And so it's really critical that you have the right amount of the right jerseys in the marketplace to be able to capitalize on that investment in the NFL. Now, why is that a challenge? Well, think about that as how many teams are there in the NFL? 32 teams. And most of them have a home and away and an alternate jersey. And you also want to offer jerseys in different qualities. But then you also have different sizes. And with NFL jerseys, you don't just have small, medium, large, and extra large, but there are some larger players in the NFL, so you need XXL and quadruple XL as well as sizes. And then, as you know, a lot of these jerseys are sold with a name and a number on the back. And so if you're a fan of Russell Wilson, you'll want that number and that name on the back. And so that is another specification or different stock keeping unit. And if you multiply the teams times the type of jerseys times the sizes and the name and the number, you end up with 20,000 different SKUs that you have. And so try and imagine how to make the right amount of the right product and have it at the right place when you have 20,000 different SKUs. Now, the way most apparel and all the apparel that you're wearing here, most of it, the companies that made that apparel had made a forecast and made 100% of that forecast before any product was sold. So your yellow jersey was made in full quantity in all of the sizes before you or anybody else had purchased the jersey. Now, that has a significant risk in it, because what if yellow isn't so popular anymore? Maybe that jersey wouldn't sell as much. But think about that in terms of the NFL when you have 20,000 SKUs. What if there's a player on a team that gets injured and is not playing and you have a huge amount of inventory? Or a player that changes teams. So Tom Brady is obviously a pretty reliably successful player and sells a lot of jerseys. But he played for New England and he went to Tampa Bay, and you don't want to be stuck with a lot of New England jerseys. So it's really hard to try and forecast in advance how much of these jerseys you need to make. You can't really do it. And so, and then on top of that, it's a single season business. Most of it's sold during the fall and the winter. So you don't have a lot of time to recover afterwards. So on the one hand, you want to make sure you have the right number of these jerseys in place so you can realize the return on the investment you've made. But on the other hand, you don't want to be stuck with inventory at the end of it because you won't be able to sell it for 9 months. And the chances at the end of it, that player may change teams or that team may not do so well. So you're in this conundrum and how do you solve it? And you can't solve it by buying all this product in advance. So how do you solve this question? Well, the way we did that at Nike is said, okay, you have to realize that a jersey isn't just a finished product, but it consists of yarn that then turns into grayish fabric, that then gets dyed, that gets cut and sewn into a jersey, and then eventually a name and a number is put on it. And if you think about those as different products, you could potentially manufacture those different stages in different places, and you could keep inventory of these different products, different levels of inventory. So for example, yarn and grayish fabric, really the variability of that is determined by the total number of jerseys sold. Doesn't matter which team, doesn't matter which player. A cut and sewn jersey tends to have is dependent on that team's success. And a name and number jersey is dependent on that player's success. So if you think about it that way, you could also say, well, we can make the grayish fabric maybe in a place where that's less expensive and order that all in advance. And so one of you talked about raw material purchasing as a way to create a buffer. So that's basically the raw material purchasing. And then you may have a 4-month lead time for that. The actual cut and sew may happen somewhere closer to market, where you have maybe a month lead time, and you can order more quickly. And the name and number putting on, you could put something really close to market and be able to do that on a weekly basis. So you could order and have it delivered a week later. And that's exactly what we did at Nike at the time. So we made most of the raw material in Asia, which is where the factories were and where you could buy in large quantities at a reasonable cost. Most of the jerseys were cut and sewn in Central America, where you could truck it into the United States. And the actual embellishment was happening in a factory in the United States. So and then basically every week, what we would do is what we call the Monday morning quarterback meeting. So you would have the games that happened over the weekend, and we'd say, okay, which teams are doing well, which players are injured, which players are playing really well, what is selling right now, and what do we think is going to happen? And during that time, we would make new orders for certain name and number jerseys, new buffer inventories for teams, and then usually we didn't have to order more raw material, but if the overall volume would go up or down, we may make adjustments as well there. And so by doing this, now you can actually be responding within the season and making sure that you try to always be in stock with every product at a name and number that jersey that you want to have, and not have anything left at the end of the season. Now that's the ideal state, but you can get much closer to that than you would if you manufactured all of that in one batch and placed one order for the whole season. I hope that's a little bit clear, and you can see how you can both balance still being cost effective and at the same time being much more responsive in managing a supply chain like that. So that's the example of the NFL that I wanted to use to illustrate kind of how you can think about speed and flexibility in a supply chain and not just think about it as a static model where you have to order large quantities in advance. So what happened with the toilet paper? And you can ask me some questions about the NFL later. This is my theory. I don't actually know for a fact the answer, but I think this is the answer. And it shows that, that there is inflexibility in a supply chain that can cause problems. So COVID in the beginning led to panic that all sorts of product was going to run out. And people were like, okay, we got to hoard this stuff. And then, you know, on TV, they would show people hoarding stuff and say, thou shalt not hoard. Well, if you want to make sure that people hoard, you should tell them, thou shalt not hoard, because people want to get ahead of the neighbor who, you know, I'm not a hoarder, but my neighbor is a hoarder, and I also want to have toilet paper, so I'm going to. And so now then what, in my head, what happened is, because you see these pictures on TV and you see a shopping cart, Well, what sticks out of a shopping cart is that big, bulky toilet paper thing that everybody sees. Now, the fact that shampoo was down below or some other things, you didn't see, but that toilet paper was very visible. So that became the thing that people said, oh my God, the toilet paper is going to run out. And everybody bought toilet paper. And of course, the toilet paper supply chain isn't ready for such a spike in demand. So then you actually are going to run out of toilet paper for a short period of time. Now, what happened really is, I'm pretty sure that COVID didn't make people go to the bathroom more often and didn't make them use more toilet paper. So at the end of this kind of all worked itself through when people realized they didn't really need more toilet paper and they in fact could get toilet paper. And so in the end, this problem kind of worked itself through. And it was a temporary problem. Now, there are many other examples of categories that were affected, and some of them are affected like toilet paper, which is demand for toilet paper didn't change, and the production for toilet paper didn't have to change. There was just a temporary blip. But there are also some things that have perhaps changed more permanently. I recently had to make a trip and wanted to rent a car. Anybody try to rent a car recently? It's pretty expensive, isn't it? Why are car rentals so expensive now? And now this is what happened. I noticed through Hertz. Hertz basically ran into, so COVID happened and nobody was traveling. And so nobody was renting cars. And they were facing potential bankruptcy. So what they did is, we're going to sell these cars. And it happened to be a very hot used rental market. So they actually, or used car market, because a lot of people were thinking they may need a car. They didn't want to go in the bus anymore. So they were actually able to sell a lot of these cars at reasonable prices. It saved them from bankruptcy. But now travel is picked up again, and they can't buy any cars, because actually there's a chip shortage. And there's therefore a car shortage, and now they can't buy any cars. And so the cars that they have, they're renting at huge premium prices. All of this will work itself out over time as well. It's a temporary blip, but it's a real blip. And one of the ones that I experienced is I just moved to Bend recently, and of course, I got to stock up on all the toys to take advantage of what you can do here. Well, try to get a kayak, try to get a bike. There's just shortage of all of that stuff, because there's been a tremendous demand for people have wanted to do things outdoor, and those supply chains are not set up to ramp up so quickly, and so you have a lot of shortages in there. One of the businesses that I'm also involved, this is why I'm wearing a suit, is Suitsupply, and suits are coming back, I tell you. I know Bend is going to take a little bit more effort, but. So this company I'm involved with actually sells suits and also casual clothing. And they basically sell pretty high quality suits at a reasonable price. That business kind of went down the tank. Imagine that. People are all working from home. People are being casual anyway. Who needs a suit nowadays? But it's coming back because a lot of people buy suits for weddings. And actually, what happened in 2008 and 9 when there was a recession, it went down, and then when it came back, the suit business went up tremendously. One of the things that they did in response to COVID is they offered appointment visits in the store that you had with a single individual, so you didn't have to deal with too many other people, and you could get custom suits made. And so the custom suit business is growing tremendously, and they're actually going to come out of this stronger than they went into this. So some of these are short-term problems, some of these are one-year problems, and there may be some that there's a complete shift in demand that will happen longer term. But my guess is there will be a lot of post-COVID supply chain challenges because things ramp up that we didn't expect, and where we were over-inventoried now we're going to be short, and where it may also be that some of the companies that ramped up their production on the outdoor products, that they will find that actually now they may have ordered too much next year. I don't know if it's true, but I'm sure that could happen. So, yeah, this COVID, what they call a black swan event, that's something that you don't often see, a black swan. I think it was, because it affected everything and it had such a big impact. But the reality is in supply chain, stuff happens all the time. 9/11 happened, there are recessions that happen, and then resurgence happens. There are weather events. There were the floods in Thailand at some point. There's the tsunami that then led to the nuclear meltdown in Japan. Sometimes boats sink or they get stuck in the Suez Canal. People strike in ports. There are trade wars. People have almost forgotten that there was a 25% tariff on products coming out of China that the American administration imposed, and Brexit happened. And this stuff happens all the time in supply chain. And I think the advice that I would have is just, during these times, stay calm. You should be doing scenario planning because stuff like this happens all the time. And this notion of having forecasts that are precise, much better off having wide ranges of what could happen and how might I respond to that. If you can then build in resilience, which I know for a small company is really difficult to do because you don't have the option to have 3 different factories for the same thing. But think about ranges of what might happen and how you deal with it, because your forecast is either going to be incredibly lucky, but more likely it's going to be wrong. Keep your ear to the ground, and then and companies that are really good at scrambling and responding quickly are oftentimes better off. So, I remember when I came to Suitsupply and the COVID thing had just happened. Initially, the CEO and the CFO said, this is it's in China and nothing will happen. It took quite a while for us to try to convince them that this was serious. I think those companies that responded most quickly and did do some raw material purchases, and so if you they fared better. So if you keep your ear to the ground and respond quickly, you're a lot better chance of doing well. Like John Wooden said, be quick, but don't hurry. So the key takeaways, and I'm just making sure that I'm doing okay on time. I think supply chain is a balancing act, and it's a betting game. It's not an exact science. It's not precise. There's a huge amount of uncertainty, and if you can balance between cost and responsiveness and make the right bets and treat it more like poker than I don't know what other game I would call it, but not poker. I talked about this range and scenario planning. What could happen? What if this happens? How might I respond to that? Try to build in the resilience so you can deal with these different scenarios. Investing in the right partnerships that can help you in dealing with that. Keep your ear to the ground. Rapid cross-functional information flow. I think communication is the most important skill in a supply chain leader, being able to figure out what's going on in the other functions and communicate with the other functions. And scrambling and creativity. When life deals you lemons, you make lemonade out of it. So when Suitsupply ran out of suits, they made custom appointments or personal appointments and custom made, and that's going to help them get it through. Of course, it's all different when you're small. Your demand is even more uncertain. You don't have much money, you don't have much resources, and you don't have much power. And so you have to deal with those limitations. At the same time, you do have one benefit, which is you get to build it from scratch and you get to do it right. So if you think about this up front and you really think about strategically, how can I build a supply chain that can be responsive and agile and resilient, you have a much better chance of doing it right. And undoing a supply chain that was built the wrong way is a lot harder than building one from scratch. So with that, I'll let you ask any questions you may have.
I just want to say please, a round of applause. There were several times where I wanted to chime in, like, did people buy bidets? Rental cars are expensive. Please don't bring up Tom Brady again. And what was your highlight of being at Nike?
What was my highlight?
What was like the coolest thing that happened while you were at Nike?
Well, it's a lot. I mean, it's a great place. And I didn't stay there for 18 years if I didn't think it was a great place. I mean, the people there are what I would say was the most exciting part. It's a very positive, collaborative, just do it type of culture. And that's infectious to work with that. And so people there do not complain about another function. They walk up there and they collaborate with that function and they get stuff done, and they get stuff done quickly. And it is a lot of fun to be involved with something that is positive, like sports is positive and exercise is positive. And I got to go to some really cool sports events too. Tour de France being my favorite.
Oh, cool. That's so cool. I want a suit. I just also wanted to insert that. Okay, we have many questions. Yes?
All right. Nothing about toilet paper.
Nothing about toilet paper.
Right. Now let's talk about Nike and the NFL.
Nike and the NFL.
So the Fanatics deal.
Yes.
Is that a supply chain play, or is that a strange go-to-market?
The Fanatics deal.
Well, I think in the end, this happened after I wasn't involved in it anymore, and I think they basically wanted to outsource a lot of this. Like Nike wants to focus on its core activities, and my read of this, what I hear, is just outsourcing a lot of the work involved with that to a company that is in that business, and that's where that's why I think they did it.
The Fanatics deal. They wanted to outsource.
Yeah, sorry, people don't know, but that's a company that partners with Nike to do a lot of the NFL stuff there.
The NFL. Claire.
Do you have any insight about how supply chain disruptions like COVID-19 affect luxury markets versus commodity markets?
Insights as to how things like COVID-19 affect supply chain for luxury markets versus, commodities? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I don't know if I do. I mean, if you're asking on the demand side, I always think that, I actually want to buy a hat so I can buy your product, which is, I think it's a fantastic product. And so my sense is the luxury market is more resilient during times like this, and there's always a space for that. And I think the more mass market, the swings are much bigger there. I also personally believe that this sort of shift to making things the right way and charging a premium for it is absolutely the right place to be. It's personally what I would want to buy, but I also think consumers are becoming much more discerning, and it'll go slowly, and there's always that mass market consumer that's just looking for the cheapest thing, but I think people are more and more aware of how things are made, and I believe sustainability and how and that making that integral to how a company works is essential, and that can command a premium, I think.
Well, I think there may be a seat on their board for you, Hans, so that we can make that happen later. Any other questions for Hans in the audience? I'm so curious to see too, like in terms of luxury goods, I know there's these like Affirm and Forley and these like sort of middlemen, you can pay this thing off in 4 payments. It makes luxury goods so much more accessible to people when you can pay it in 4 payments. So I feel like something like that could help. Yes. MVP question asker of the night, you, sir. Yeah.
I'm gonna be a little geek here. You mentioned like black swan, and you kind of talked about like fragile, durable. It made me think of like the concept of like anti-fragile, if you're familiar with that.
Yeah, I
The
think
anti-fragile movement in terms of
you're-
black swan. What is happening? Am I stroking out?
this may be something
I
that
know
you-
those
that-
words. I don't know them in that order. Okay, anti-fragile movement.
So the idea being, it's like, okay, like if it's an inflexible supply chain, any uncertainty, it's gonna break down. And if it's durable, the idea is like, well, it's not gonna get better, but it can kind of withstand things.
Yeah.
And then the anti-fragile is like, it takes adversity and it makes the system stronger as a result.
So anti-fragile makes it stronger. Durable means it can get through. The other one is a total breakdown.
Yeah,
Hans, take it.
I do actually remember reading a book about this anti-fragile, but it's been a while. I will sort of wing an answer to your question in that, using the Suitsupply example, they buy most of their wool out of New Zealand and Australia. They make most of their fabrics in Italy, and then they manufacture most of their, so put the suits together in China. And one of the things that they did is say, hey, if you're just dependent on China, and if you have 5 factories in China, what if something happens in China, and it did with tariffs, now you're screwed, because now your costs go up by 25%. So even if you're a relatively small company, you're much better off sourcing your product in more than one country to just not have that risk of something happening with that country. And so I think even when you're small, I think you can start diversifying and in how you set up your supply chain. And I think this thinking through what might happen and trying to build less fragility, more resilience into the supply chain is how you solve that.
Yes.
So here in Central Oregon, there's a lot of consumer products companies. They're small. How would you advise thinking about when to do something in-house versus when to outsource?
So
Whether
the-
it's manufacturing or supply chain?
So there's a lot of small manufacturing companies here in Bend. When would you advise them to do something in-house versus outsourcing?
Yeah, I think you have to ask yourself the question of what is it that you want to be famous for as a company? Like, what are you a product innovation company? Are you a brand company? Or are you a manufacturing company? And are you a manufacturing company if you envision that you're going to be 10 or 100 times the size that you are perhaps in the first year, then is the answer still the same? And I think for a lot of companies, maybe they don't want to be a manufacturing company. I think Nike was a small company at some point and it had its own factories. Nike has still a little bit of in-house manufacturing, mostly for airbags and some very specific things, but it's grown big by really developing partnerships. There are 40 companies it works with that do footwear, and there are more companies that do apparel. And Nike can deliver innovation and quality and be in the right channels without having to own its manufacturing. So for Nike, the answer is that's outsourced. Nike even outsources a lot of its marketing because they have companies like Wieden and Kennedy that do that for them. And so I think you have to ask that question for your own company, which is what is it really that you want to be famous for? And I think if you want to be famous for manufacturing, then you have to keep that in-house. But that's a difficult thing to do and scale and be successful at, I would say.
But it is possible. Anne?
Beyond diversification, how else would you suggest that a small startup stay lean in their supply chain?
Beyond diversification, how would you suggest a small startup stay lean?
Yeah, lean, I think if you mean building in resilience so you can deal with fluctuations in demand. And I think one of you mentioned buying raw materials so that you're not going to run out of products. And so inventory has a bad rap because you don't want to be left with it. But if you can buy inventory in a format that you can reuse it, so in the NFL examples, it would be gray fabric and not a name and number jersey. And I think, I don't see her anymore, but she talked about having the raw materials of the balls that went into the bottles. And, you know, those may be the things that you want to stock up on so that if something unexpected happens, that you're not going to be out of ability to make product. Yeah, and I think partnerships, I would try to, and when you're small, maybe you're too small to be able to be relevant to larger companies. And so you may have to do some of that in-house yourself. But as soon as you can start looking at who can do this for you, whose business it is, then building those partnerships really helps you stay lean and build in that flexibility.
Thank you.
Aaron?
How do you decide which companies you work with now or serve on the board?
How do you decide which companies you work with now or serve on the board?
It's always the people and the purpose of the company. I would never work for a company that I don't feel aligned with their mission, and you know, to me, it's really important that it does something that makes the planet slightly better or much better, ideally. And then the people have to be people that I enjoy working with, and that for me means that they're positive, collaborative. That they're, you know, I don't really like when people aren't transparent or when there is political gamesmanship going on. That's not kind of my style, and so I try to assess that. And then you know, the industry has to be something that I get excited about, and so I've kind of, some stuff has come at me. One of the things I didn't say is next year I'm going to spend a year at Stanford, and it gives me an opportunity. I can talk offline what I'm going to do there. but to kind of explore also some new ideas and new avenues. And so I'm excited about that. But Bend's my home base, so I'm living here long term.
That's great. Awesome. Yes, Kate. What is your favorite thing about Bend?
The beer that I will be drinking after I'm done with this talk is one of my favorite things in Bend, is that there are lots of those options. I think I love the outdoors here, and my good friend Todd, who is one of my other favorite things in Bend, along with Kim, his girlfriend, taught me how to fly fish the other day.
Oh.
So I'm adding a new skill to it. I do think we bought some skins, and my son and I did some skinning this winter, and I think that was really my favorite activity. I've got a beautiful picture on the top of, what's the mountain right next to Tamalo, with a beautiful view, and but I'm looking forward to exploring a lot more of the outdoor activities here. It's a wonderful place.
Well, there's something every direction you go. Well, this is actually a perfect transition. It's our tradition here to give our EDCO keynote speakers
an empty glass.
An empty glass. But I mean, if it's full, it holds 4 beers. So
Okay.
Hans, you are the recipient of something special here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you
coming
very
and
much.
talking with us tonight.
Yeah.